Hey, welcome to the Walk with Jesus podcast, the very first episode. My name is Dakota Lee, and if you're anything like me, then you are also seeking to understand the supernatural through the light of Jesus Christ. I've always been interested in the world beyond this physical one, not only because it's a feature of all the Bible stories, but also when I was 4 years old, I started to see into the supernatural. When I was a little kid, not even in school yet, I was downstairs wrapping a present with my mom, and I started to speak and tell her what I was just seeing in my head. And my mom recognized it as a vision from God and wrote it down. And the next 2 hours kicked off a permanent theme for my life where God would give me insight, often insight that I had no business knowing or couldn't have gotten from anywhere else, that explained his kingdom, Jesus, and eventually even heaven. When I was 8 years old, I saw angels for the first time. When I was 10 years old, I met Jesus Christ, for the first time. And then at 12, God started letting me visit heaven and has never stopped. And I've been through ups and downs. No, my faith has not been solid all the way through, but I just had my 29th birthday. I kind of think of this starting this podcast as a bit of a happy birthday. To me, from God, to me, I'm not sure, but I'm grateful that I get to start it now and that I'm finally brave enough to share these stories more than just on 1 to 5 minute clips on social media. So, as is fitting with a title of the Walk with Jesus podcast, the first episode is about Jesus Christ, and my very real experience with him. I can truly say he's my best friend. I truly know it, I feel it, and I'm privileged that I'm one of the people that can say that. So many wonder who he is as a person, and a lot of people actually get very upset with me when I speak of Jesus as so casually. But what Jesus has shown me, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but what Jesus has shown me is that yes, he is the king, but I'm his sister. And that makes me the princess, but it still makes me his sister. And if you can imagine the relationship between a pair of royal siblings, would they not be casual with each other? Would they not sometimes, if they have a good relationship, tell each other how they're really feeling and have jokes and play a little bit, but also know when it's time to be serious and when it's time to get work done? That is a big part of my relationship with Jesus. And I want to tell you more about him because the love that he has given me is something that I really believe can solve the world's problems. Cliche or not, I really believe that, and I want to share what I have found in him with you. So, without further ado, let me start telling you about my experiences with Jesus Christ. When I was 10 years old, I was in a church service with my family, and there was worship music playing. I attended a charismatic, non-denominational church of about 150 people. Well, as the music was playing, I felt God sort of tap my shoulder, get my attention, and say, Dakota, I want you to look behind you. So I turn around in the seats. I open my spiritual eyes, which is different than having my physical eyes open, and I'm someone that can at will look in the spirit or turn that off and not look in the spirit. But I opened my spiritual eyes and looked behind me at the doors of the sanctuary. And I saw, as not the physical doors, but the spiritual essence of those doors blew open. And Jesus, the Spirit of Jesus Christ, walked straight through. How did I know it was him? I think when you spend so much time getting to know the Father, know his Spirit, understand the Holy Spirit, hear stories of Jesus Christ, and just understand their energy, you already recognize him. I already recognized him when he walked through those doors. That was Jesus Christ. He walked down the center aisle as the worship music was playing, and he didn't look at me, although I know he knew that I saw him. I am grateful that he didn't look at me that first time because I might have passed out. I'm not sure. It meant a whole lot and still does, but especially that first time at 10 years old. I saw Jesus as he went over to a woman that was about on the third row. She was probably in her 60s, and she at that moment had been kneeling on her knees as she prayed while the worship music was playing. Jesus knelt down next to her. He put his hand on her back, and he whispered something to her. And even though I was all the way across the auditorium, all the way across the room, I could hear what he was saying to her. And when he stood up, I knew I was going to have to tell her, because that's what I did. As someone who had been seeing in the spirit for years at that point, I knew that sometimes the angels would show me something and then instruct me to tell that person what just happened in the spiritual world. Sometimes angels would pull sickness out of somebody's body. Sometimes they would deliver a message. Sometimes they would do a kind of spiritual surgery, and I just needed to inform the person of what happened. And so this was not much different, except, of course, that it is Jesus Christ that is the one delivering a message. Jesus stands back up, and he walks out of the room. That was my first encounter with him, and I had to wait the entire service, 45 more minutes, before, at 10 years old, I took my mom. I'm telling you, my hands were shaking. I was so scared to deliver this message. It's always scary telling adults what God has for you when you're a kid. And yet, when I had my mom backing me up, it was okay enough that I could continue. After the church service, I walked up to the woman, and as she was packing up her purse, I said, "Excuse me." Now, everyone in the church kind of knew I had something going on in the spirit, because I would do this regularly. I would go up to people and tell them the message from God. So she turned to me, had a little curiosity in her eyes, and I said, again, trying to keep my voice from shaking, "I have a gift to see in the spirit, and Jesus showed me something for you. Can I share it with you?" She about dropped her purse on the chair next to her, squared up, faced me, and nodded. Her eyes were huge. And I told her what I saw. I said, "I watched Jesus Christ walk into the church, kneel next to you, put his hand on your back, and say, 'It's okay. You can rest now. You can rest now.'" And then he stood up, and he left about the third song in our worship. And this woman looked at me, and she took it in, and I was used to, honestly, at this point, a lot of tears after I'd been sharing these messages with people. I was used to people crying, as it meant so much, especially a visit from Jesus. Like, oh my gosh. And instead of all that, she just kept peering at me and, not rudely, but bluntly asked, "What am I supposed to do with that?" Well, it really threw me back. I wasn't sure what to say, and so I fumbled with my words then. I was hoping she was just going to take the meaning from God and not have to ask a 10-year-old what she should do with her life. And I told her, I think it means that Jesus wants you to know that you don't have to work so hard. You can just rest in him, and it'll be okay. She nodded, thoughtful look on her face, thanked me, picked up her purse, and walked out. And I felt very unsettled about it. And I went back with my mom, and when we were on our own, I asked if I'd done anything wrong. Because this woman hadn't seemed to accept the message, I felt like maybe I had gotten it wrong somehow. And my mom so cleverly made the comment, "Dakota, maybe that's exactly why Jesus had you deliver that exact message of it's time to rest, because she had so much trouble accepting the message." And that really helped me. And it helped me understand that sometimes just because people don't receive the message doesn't mean the message isn't from God. Well, that was the first time I saw Jesus, but that was definitely not the last. The next time I saw him was another church service. And at that point, I was looking for him. Like, angels are really cool, but Jesus is cooler. So I kept looking for him. And yet again, I saw him. I'm not sure he walked in through the doors, but I remember seeing him suddenly leaning against the wall during the worship service, and he was parallel to my row, and I was in the center of the row. And I just froze as I saw him. And he just laid there. He looked at me, and my heart beat so fast. And I looked at the stage. I'm like, in my head, I'm like, now what? Like, oh goodness, now that I think back, I almost wanted Jesus to give me a job. Like, Jesus, go do something so I know what I'm supposed to be doing, so I know I'm working, and I just, again, I know what to do. But Jesus didn't. And all throughout that worship service and then the sermon afterwards, Jesus kept inching closer and closer to me until he was standing next to me. I was so tight. I swear my muscles could have turned coal into diamond. I was so tense at him standing right there. And after about 20 minutes of Jesus being right next to me, I actually don't remember exactly what point I finally said this, but he had been next to me for a while, and I told him under my breath, I think I'm just going to relax now. I saw Jesus smile and nod. And I just relaxed into my seat. And over the next few times I was in church, Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, I would see Jesus there, and he began just sitting with me in the service, listening with me to the sermons. I don't remember a thing that those my pastors were saying, but I do remember Jesus sitting next to me, and then he put his arm around my shoulder, and we were just comfortable. Oh, man, that makes me emotional thinking back on those moments. It's just so special. And from that time, I got to see him more regularly. I was ready to see him more regularly. And I learned that Jesus didn't want me to be tense. He wanted me to relax and be comfortable with him because, as I said earlier, I'm his sister. And yes, I'm royalty as well. I'm divine royalty because he's made it so. But first and foremost, we are family. And he wants to love me like family. Met Jesus and got to paint him. She has 2 paintings of his, and I recognize Jesus in both. But the second one, which is less well known than the Prince of Peace, that is world famous. But there's a lesser known one that she painted called I Am, and this is the Jesus that I see when I see Jesus Christ. So, but to describe him to you, y'all can go look it up. But to describe him to you, when I see Jesus, he's about, I would say, 5'6". And the reason that I know this is because there was a time when I was a young teen, probably like 14 years old, where I went to, I should have been in bed, but I was going to the kitchen for a midnight snack. And my brother, who was 5'7" at the time, was also in the kitchen, also getting a midnight snack. And at that moment, I just looked for Jesus just because it was interesting. And I saw them standing next to each other, and it shocked me because Jesus was shorter than my brother. He was shorter than my brother. But we've also looked up at the time, and it's very likely that historically, historians believe that Jesus was probably around 5'5" to between 5 foot, I think 6 or 7, somewhere in there, because that was the average height of men in his era at the time of his life. And so it was cool to get a confirmation of what I was seeing. So Jesus is medium height on the short side. I'm not sure. He's not offended by it. I've made jokes of that before. But he's not offended at all. He thinks it's funny. Jesus also has a great sense of humor. We'll get to that later. Jesus has, I would say, like, his face shape, his jaw shape is a little bit triangular, but also like a bit of a squared jaw, but his chin is slightly more pointed than a truly squared jaw. And if there was one feature on his face that I would say sticks out, other than his eyes, it would be his nose. I would say his nose is probably just a little bit bigger. than some other features. And it's not at all a criticism. To me, he's so handsome, and I also believe that that beauty of his comes from him really knowing who he is in the Father, accepting his divinity, and just the love that emanates from him. It just paints all his features in beauty. He's just so handsome. So Jesus he has shoulder length hair. It's usually wavy. It's not tightly curled. It's kind of wavy, and it's brown. I would say his hair is, oh, you guys cannot. Well, some of you are watching this, so you can see. So his hair is a little bit often lighter than the color of my hair right now. So medium brown. And I've seen him cut his hair from time to time. He likes to keep it shoulder length, but I've even seen him, like, he once buzzed his hair really short, and that really shocked me that day, but it grew out over the next few months. Every time I'd see him, his hair was a little bit longer until it got to shoulder length again. I also tend to see Jesus with his hair pulled back in a low ponytail, but he does like to keep his hair loose. Jesus doesn't like anything really too tight. He really likes like loose fitting clothes and just not a lot of restriction. He really does like sandals. He actually does like sandals. That just makes me laugh because some of the stereotypes we would imagine about him or hear about him are actually true. That's why that makes me laugh. To talk about Jesus's eyes. Oh, that's interesting. To continue to paint the picture even before I get to his eyes, which are really cool. His eyebrows are, I would say, pretty thick. Yeah, they're definitely on the thicker side. And dark brown, I'd say slightly darker brown than his hair, the hair on his head. So to talk about his eyes, when I first saw Jesus, he actually had bright, like electric blue eyes, which is not how the historical Jesus would have shown up at all, right? He lived in an era where everyone had a shade of brown eyes, or at least in his area, and from being descended as a Jewish man, he would have had brown eyes. So it confused me for a little while. Why was I seeing blue eyes? And then one time I was hanging out with Jesus. I think I had been invited to heaven, so it was probably after a couple years, and I noticed he had brown eyes. And I said, Jesus, why do sometimes you have blue and sometimes you have brown? And Jesus pulled me close and he said, watch this. And he wanted me to look at his eyes. So he kind of had his hands on my shoulders. And in the spirit, he had his hands on my shoulders. And I watched as his eyes, the color started to, he was at brown eyes, his color started to swirl. And as it swirled, this bright, amazing blue came out. Just the blue is so bright and gorgeous. It's like alive. It's like, imagine like a tropical ocean and then turn up the intensity. So gorgeous, this eye color. And then when Jesus spoke to me, suddenly his voice sounded like a megaphone, like it hit me in the chest the way he spoke to me. And he said, this is when I'm working. And as he said that, I knew what he meant by working. Working was, if he had a message to give someone, if he needed to do a spiritual surgery and fix someone's heart, if he needed to deliver someone, if he needed to gift them a new gift or a new even emotion sometimes, then, or unleash them, or whatever it is, when he is working with his people, connecting people, loving them, healing them, then his eyes turn this bright blue color. But when he is just hanging out, just himself, laughing, maybe he's having something to eat or snack on, which, by the way, in heaven you can eat and have food, although it's definitely different than physical food, but it's also much better. So in that time, he has his normal brown eye color, and I really love both. But when I see the bright blue-eyed Jesus, that really informs me, okay, we're serious and we had better get to work. So I hope that gives you a good description. Oh man, I need to talk about the nails, the nail holes. I don't like talking about this, even though it's really important, because, I'm already getting emotional. I know him so, I just know him as my my friend, he's brought so much good to me. And to see the pain that he really went through and know he really didn't deserve that, like it still hurts to think about it. But I will do my best to describe the nail holes. Um, they're not in his hands, they're in his wrists. Which is also, by the way, accurate. I don't know if you guys have done any research in this, but I've done a lot of research onto what historians believe happened in the life of Jesus and what he probably looked like and appeared like. And at the time, even though it's written in the Bible, they pierced his hands. At the time, the wrist was considered part of the hand. And we know from Roman practices of crucifixion that, in fact, they did nail the victims to the cross through the wrist. So, but at 12, when I saw this, 11, no, probably 11 or 12, I'm not sure. But Jesus showed me, and I didn't know that historically, but it certainly matches with what I know now. I remember that day. Again, I don't remember exactly how old I was, probably 12, because I believe that Jesus had taken me to this really beautiful place in heaven. It was just a forest, and there was a log that had either grown sideways or had fallen. I got to think about that because there's no death in heaven, so I'm not sure exactly if we were sitting on a sideways tree that grew sideways or if it had fallen, what the case was with that. But we were sitting on a log, and as we sat there, I looked over at Jesus. He was on I think he was on my left. I think I was to his right. And I just suddenly thought, can I see? When Jesus put his arms forward, the sleeve of his tunic came back a little bit, and I saw the holes in his wrist, straight through his wrist. And they were large, and I could see straight through to the other side. They're big enough to fit a coin through, and on both sides. I believe on his right wrist, they're not perfectly round. There's like a protrusion of some kind, almost like I could see either bone or tendon or something, like half, almost sticking out, like and his skin covers it, and the skin inside is a little bit pink. Like it's as healthy as scar tissue could be, but it is scar tissue. And he held them out for me, and I started to get really emotional. Of course. It's really hard to see. It's really hard to see that and get a depth of the pain that he went through. And I'm just a kid. And Jesus put his arm around me at that moment when he saw me getting so sad. And he said, it's okay because it allowed me to now have this moment with you. Wow. If he hadn't gone through that, he wouldn't have been able to be my friend. My Jesus. My Jesus. He also has holes in his wrists. No, sorry, I said wrists. I'm sorry, I'm a little emotional. He also has holes in his ankles. And one is catty corner to the other. And if you think about it, there's one nail for both his legs, and so he would have had to cross his legs on top of the other, and one was at slightly an angle. Ooh. So they're there. They're real, and they're there, and he somehow is fully functional even with those massive holes in his body. Oh, so to talk about some happier things. I'm going to tell you about the first time I got to visit heaven, because Jesus was a huge part of it. He's the one that guided me there. I wasn't seeking heaven. I didn't even know it was possible for anyone to visit heaven, except if you had like a near-death experience, and I didn't want one of those. But I was 12 years old, and for a few months before going to youth camp, my first ever going to like the teenage Christian camp at 12, all I saw when I went to spend time with God was an image of me digging through earth, dirt, tunneling down, and I didn't understand why that was so important. God didn't really explain much, but I just let him show me that, and I think I was I don't know exactly still to this day, but I think I was kind of almost like going through the depths of my own soul or going through spiritually deep enough that I would be ready for what came next. And so for months that's all I would see in the spirit. A little disconcerting when you go from seeing angels and seeing them operate to only that, but I went with it because God seemed content with it. And then at youth camp, they had a morning and an evening service. And it was a lot of worship music. It was, honestly, I loved it. Some people have terrible experiences at youth camp. That was my natural habitat. It was phenomenal. I remember at the second service, which was the first day, the evening service, I was seeing that tunneling again as the worship music was going on, and everyone was praising God. And then I felt like God tapped me on the shoulder and said, okay, that's enough. I opened my physical eyes and I took note of all the teenagers around me that were worshiping God and the stage in front of us and the singers and the musicians. And then I looked up and I had my physical and spiritual eyes open and I saw Jesus hovering above me. He held a hand down to me and he said, "You ready?" He might have said, "Are you ready?" But I take it as, "You ready?" I didn't know for what, but when Jesus asks you, "Are you ready?" What are you going to say? Yes. So I said yes. I lifted my physical hand up to meet where his hand was in the spirit. And Jesus, I watched as he gripped my own wrist with his hand, and he pulled my spirit out of my body. And for about 15 seconds, I had the extremely disconcerting experience of seeing myself twice. I was seeing myself somehow through my physical and spiritual eyes from my body, but I was also looking down at myself at the same time. And I sort of blinked, both, I guess. My spirit and my body sort of blinked, and I decided I'm going to close my physical eyes and I need to just focus on one sight. And I'll have to do another episode on the different layers of the spirit and how it's possible to have this kind of experience without passing out or dying or having a near-death experience and having my spirit almost in two places. But I essentially was with Jesus, and I realized I still had control over my body. I could have the spirit that Jesus had just brought with him. Well, for example, as I was with Jesus, I sent this message to my body, "Close your eyes, this is too much." And my eyes closed, so then I was only seeing in the spirit and only seeing as I was with Jesus. And we rose like we were helium balloons, like gentle helium balloons. And I remember our backs hitting the ceiling again gently, and I looked down at the whole scene and just took it in, and I still saw myself with my hand still up. And even though I was in the spirit, I could feel pain in my arm because I'd had my arm up for about a minute. And I asked Jesus, "Can I put my arm down?" And he goes, "Go ahead." So quickly, I just kind of bring my awareness back to my body, and I have this sensation to put a sound to what it felt like of like my spirit being pulled back to my body. I put my arm down, and then I kind of frantically in my heart was like, "Jesus," because what if I had went back to my body and had lost my experience to have whatever this was that I told Jesus I was ready for. But thankfully, I felt my spirit rising up out of my body again and went back to the ceiling with Jesus. And that is when I realized I'm actually in control here. My body's not helpless. I can return to it if I want to or need to. It's actually my choice. God is not taken over in that way. So I'm choosing every moment that I'm with Jesus. And that's good. It helped me feel better about in the spirit leaving my body where it was because I was still maintaining a connection with it. Jesus looks at me again, and I believe he says, "You ready?" again. And I say yes. And then I feel us as our spirits pass through the roof, and then we just go up and up and up. And before I know it, I am looking at the dark, because it was at the evening service. It was dark out, but I see the path that I had walked earlier that had the blackberries next to the path. I'm like, "Oh, I walked that path earlier." And Jesus, I think he just like lightly nodded. He wasn't that impressed. We had a lot more to see that night. But we kept rising up, and then I realized we were going through clouds. and then different clouds. And I was seeing the woods, and then I started to see the shape of North America. And then as I looked out, I started to see a curve on the horizon of the planet. And I saw this blue meniscus, like this just, I don't know, you see it in satellite images, but this blue rim on the edge of the horizon of the curved Earth. And then we passed through something. At that time, I thought we were just passing through like the atmosphere, because I didn't know that the air in the atmosphere of Earth kind of disperses as you go higher up. I just thought it was like, oh, there's a barrier and then you're through it and then there's no air on the other side, like it's a wall of some kind. And so what we passed through, it felt like going through an extremely thick bubble. Like if you imagine a kid's bubble that you may play with, but imagine that the wall of that bubble is like 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet thick, passing through that. That's what it felt like. And on the other side, the blackness of space was so tangible, and not in a bad way at all. It was like I looked out there and I was seeing how dark it was, like crisply dark. And I could see this, the twinkling of the stars, the sprinkling of the stars. But I also, as I looked at that darkness, I'm like, I feel like I'm looking at the rainbow at the same time. And I could almost see the colors within the blackness of space. And I just looked at Earth for a moment. It was so stunning, so beautiful. And then Jesus turned me around. He literally took my shoulders and spun me around as we were floating in space. And there was heaven. Whoa. So what I saw was, I now know really the front gate of heaven. There are actual pearly gates. And I mean, they're over 10 foot tall, 12, 18 feet tall, certainly over 10. The pearly gates themselves are in the style of like, imagine a really tall wrought iron gate, but again, made of pearl. I saw that at first. And there was also this brick wall on either side of the gates, but the brick was like made of clay and gold, if you can try to imagine somehow those two fusing. And so I thought we were going to go in through the pearly gates, but no, we were not. Jesus started to tug me to the left. So I go with Jesus, and I keep studying this wall of heaven. And I can see underneath the wall, there is what looks like this cloud base. It was only like 2 feet thick, that just was a cloudy layer, and the wall was on top of it. As we keep going to the left, the wall is starting to get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter until the wall completely dissipates into the cloudy base. There is no more wall. And now I can see into heaven. And you know what was on the other side? I always get emotional as I tell this part of the story. But there was God. He was in the throne room. And I need to describe the throne room before I get to describing God, because the throne room is this, it's filled with, the floor is just pretty much a football field of golden tiles. And at the back of this room is God's throne and Jesus's throne. And God was sitting on his throne, and I remember seeing him. And at the time, he looked like the size of a really big football player if I were the size of a toddler. And we floated in to the throne room, Jesus guiding me. And as we floated over the tiles, I could feel a certain kind of gravity take hold, and my feet hit the tile, the golden tile. And I saw God lean down while he sat in his throne and open his arms wide to me, like, come to me. Come to me, honey. Come to me, child. And y'all, I booked it. I ran, took off the moment my feet got traction on that golden floor. I took off running for him. And I reached him, and he scooped me up. And he just held me. That's it. He just held me while I was in his arms. And I was just breathing in. I was just breathing in liquid peace. That's what it was. Every breath was this renewal. Every single breath, I truly felt like I was swimming in peace, and he just had me in my arm and in his arms. And we spent 15 minutes probably in earth time. Heaven and earth time does not always match up. And we spent 15 minutes, and I know that because I could still faintly hear the worship songs that my body back on earth was experiencing. And I knew 3 of them had passed, with each one being about 5 minutes. So I knew 15 to 20 minutes had passed, and then I could hear when the songs had stopped, and it was time to return to my body. And I didn't want to go, but I felt, I also, oh man, to reflect on that time, I also didn't want to be seen as so weird by my peers. Oh, thank goodness I've been very much so released from that, but I guess isn't that every teenage experience? And so I got this sense, God also agreed it was time to go, but I didn't want to. But as I sat up in his arms, I got this sense of, to put a sound to the feeling of just being pulled back to my body. And within 1.5 seconds, I saw everything that had gotten me there in reverse. So went back through, left heaven, went back through that bubble layer, which I guess would be the firmament that's spoken about, a spiritual firmament that's spoken about in Genesis, and then was sucked through the clouds, through the ceiling, and back into my body. And I was amazed, but as I went to bed that night, I was wondering, am I going to ever get to experience that again? Or is this just one of those stories I'll tell? And the next night, I got to go again. And for probably the next 10 times I was in a worship service, maybe even 15 times that I had a chance to just be with God, I got to be brought back to heaven by Jesus Christ and got to spend my time in the arms of God, who clearly loved me more than I had ever received in my life. Whew. Wow. And God was so happy to have me. And that is why I really know what it is when Jesus in the Bible refers to God as the Father. I get it. He's my father. He's my dad. He really, really loves me. Oh my goodness. So I'm gonna take just a moment to describe God as I saw him. And there's gonna be some of you who, you know your Bible, and you know that it said that no one has seen God the Father, except if you've seen, Jesus also says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But I have asked God, why have I seen you? And other people haven't. And what God has told me is, he had a perfect metaphor for me. He said, well, Dakota, would you say that anyone has seen the sun, the physical sun of our solar system? And I go, well, I mean, we have pictures of it, but maybe not. And God said, that's right, because every picture has a bunch of filters on it. And he said, those filters are there to help us humans better understand the sun and understand how it works and its moods even. And God said, in that same way, Dakota, I have filtered my glory so that you can see me, but you haven't really seen all of me. And yet this filter helps you understand me. So that explains what business I have seeing God the Father. He found a way for me to perceive him. So as I've known God throughout the years, he's gotten bigger. He was that football player size when I first saw him at 12. And now when I see God, he's like the size of a house, and I fit like a mouse in his hand. And so I can stand on his shoulder and put my hand on his cheek. And sometimes he's often seated on his throne, or that's where I'll see him. If he's not on his throne in heaven, it doesn't mean he's not in charge, because he gets to be everywhere, really. But if he'll walk around, I can sometimes sit on his shoulder or stand on his shoulder as he moves around. It's quite an experience. When I look at Jesus versus God the Father, they are different, separate entities, which Jesus, when he was on earth, often referred to the Father as separate from himself. So it's just understanding the Trinity. And I've gotten, because I can see all three of the Trinity, I have a very clear understanding that they are separate and yet incredibly connected, so much so that you can call them one. But when I look at God, he definitely has a much more square jaw than Jesus does. And if I try to define his hair color, sorry, I'm laughing because I've tried so many times before, but if I go to look at God's hair, I want to say it's a light brown just at first glance. But then if I really stare at his hair, I think, wait a second, somehow is your hair white? Or is it reddish? Or do I see yellow gold in there? And I asked this of God, why do I see so much? And he just laughs. And it's basically, again, that filter. I cannot perceive his true hair color. So at first glance, it seems a light brown. God's eyes are my favorite. Well, I also love to just give God a hug, and I can feel his heart. His heart itself is such a strong energy. Man, that's a good thing. So that might be my favorite of his, but I love his eyes. And his eyes are, if you could imagine, I would say a white galaxy. Like, I don't know if you've ever had a computer that had the screensavers of galaxy and star images, like a white galaxy. And it just contains all the colors in his beautiful eyes, and they truly do sparkle. More than sparkle, it's deeper than sparkle, but sparkle is still the right word. As I was preparing for this episode, I decided I wanted to introduce you guys to Jesus and now also God, I asked Jesus some questions. Some things I have never asked him before, so you can get to know him a little better. So one of the first questions that I asked Jesus is, what's your favorite color? Funny enough, I never asked Jesus this, and he told me blue. Jesus Christ told me blue. And I asked, why blue? And there was a natural understanding that blue is also the Holy Spirit color, or that's how I see the Holy Spirit when he shows up. So it's nice to have that acknowledgement. But Jesus says, like the clearest blue sky. And I realize that relates to his ministry when he was on earth. That blue sky was openness and freedom. And it was often just him and the open elements. He would even walk away from his disciples at times. It was really just him and God. I've asked him this next question before. What's your favorite snack? And this was about a year ago I asked him this, and he sort of shrugged and showed me, well, there is this kind of nut that I liked. And I memorized the image, and I realized it's an almond. Jesus likes almonds, but he said that he really likes to take the time to crack it open. It's just something nice to like fidget with his hands and to do with his hands, and that's familiar, and he enjoys that. So he likes almonds. I just asked him, Jesus, do you have a favorite animal? And he said, no. He goes, but I am familiar and drawn to donkeys. And I said, are you joking? And he goes, I'm not. And that makes sense. There's a lot of good donkeys in his story when he's on earth. I asked Jesus if he's ever had a dog, and he says, no, he's never had a dog, but because so many of his followers love dogs, he has loved many, many dogs. But there's never been a dog that was just his. Okay. I asked him an odd question. I said, do you have a favorite bedtime? I don't know why I asked him that one, but do you have a favorite bedtime? And Jesus says, I liked when I was on earth. Well, first he reminded me, Dakota, sleep. I don't sleep in heaven. And there's rest in heaven, but not sleep, not like you just become unconscious. And I know there's some Bible verses pertaining to the kingdom of heaven or people sleeping. And I'll need to describe that on another episode. But rest is it's different in heaven. And so he said, but Jesus said, but when I was on earth, I like to stay up just 1 hour after sunset. And he goes, I really would have my whole body would just wind down as truly all the light was leaving the area. So he liked to stay up 1 hour after sunset. I was interesting. I said, you didn't just go to bed at sunset? And he's like, well, it was some joke like, I'm not a grandpa. And I think it was a joke too. As the older you get, a lot of people like to go to bed earlier and earlier and earlier. So Jesus was saying like, I'm not that old, but yet he is old. And yet he's also young. Okay. A couple more questions. I asked him, what's your favorite hairstyle? And he said he really likes it when his hair is out and loose, but he will sometimes do it in a low ponytail and tie it out of his face. And then I asked him, what's your biggest wish for the world? Kind of a heavy hitter. And he said, he was thoughtful, and he said, I wish them peace. And he said, I wish them peace in eternal life. And I have laid out the path. But it's not so easy while you're in the world to see that the path is there. And Jesus said that's why suffering becomes a tool for God. And there's more to explain on that, because I'm not saying that God causes suffering. I don't believe he wants that. And truthfully, I couldn't trust a God that caused my suffering. I just couldn't. And yet what Jesus is saying is that God uses suffering as a tool, because when you're suffering, that's when you have to look for more meaning. You have to look beyond just this world. And that is when you often find God. And you find him through Jesus. To bring back to a Bible verse, I'll leave you guys with this. In Matthew 7:7, I believe it's seek and you will find, ask and it will be given, knock and the door will be open to you. And I like to live by that and live by that promise. So I'm seeking Jesus and I have found him. And I hope today's episode helped you feel closer to Jesus Christ as well, because as he is my best friend, truly, he also wants to be that with you. And just because I get to see him doesn't mean that the connection that's available to you in Jesus Christ is any less rich. And so I encourage you to seek him with everything you've got, because it's worth it. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, and I'll see you next time.